to welcome you all here this afternoon. My name is George Westaver. I'm the principal here at Pusey House. It's a special delight to look forward to hearing what our Matraszek fellow, Jonathan Price, Dr. Jonathan Price, has to say about Boethius and the concept of the person. Perhaps what kind of wine the person likes. We hear a bit about that?
Yeah.
Different wines for different...
This person, yes.
Different wine for different concepts of person. This has been a long interest of Jonathan. It comes out of his academic work at Leiden, from which he has his PhD. He thinks anybody who talks to Jonathan will hear lots about the person, law, and Boethius will come up. Yeah. So, Boethius is a neglected theologian, a neglected philosopher, extremely important in the development of our concept of the person, which is going to be, we're going to hear more about that this afternoon. And, as I said, Jonathan is our Matraszek Fellow. It's a great pleasure to have Matraszek here today. Marek, welcome to Pusey House. Welcome back. Marek supports our academic program, makes the work which Jonathan does possible, supports the Center of Theology, Law and Culture. He's a graduate of Magdalen College, makes his home somewhere near Warsaw these days, and has been a great encouragement to us, and is himself very much interested in the importance of defending and promoting the doctrine of the incarnation, understanding what kind of people we are, and questions of theological anthropology. Particularly appropriate this term, because this term we have a program specifically designed to ask questions about the concept of the person, the Imago Dei series leading up to our theological conference this summer. So our last three offerings, the importance of being human next week, inspired by the work of Eric Maskell, given by Christopher Smith, and then the next week, raising Christ's voice, considering the concept of personhood in St. Augustine by Alberto Garzoni. And all of that leading up to the theological conference, restoring the image, thinking about how we are created, how we're redeemed in Christ, and how understanding the human person helps us to understand the world in which we live. I'm going to send around an email list. If any of you would like to have emails about our lectures about once a week, if you're not on an email list, please add your name here. Thank you. This is the annual Matraszek lecture, and this gives us an opportunity to thank not only Mr. Matraszek, but the work that Jonathan has been doing to amplify and expand the academic program of the House, not only helping us to focus on questions of theology, but also more broader questions of culture and law. And he's really given a great interest to the expansion of our program these last 4 or 5 years. And I won't say much more, Jonathan, just how glad we are to have you speak to us on Boethius and the concept of the human person.
Thank you so much. I'll extend also my gratitude to Marek Matraszek, who's not only benefactor but friend, and we've managed to maintain that, which isn't always possible. And so I thank you for your great humaneness to be able to give and receive with gratitude, which is a high mark of your civility and of your Christian gentlemanliness. So thank you so much for what you've done here and made possible. To Pusey House, to the chapter, Father George and Father Mark, the other two members, to the trustees who've made this possible, including Bishop Michael Langrish, the head of our trustees, whom I saw earlier and is just here. To the St. Cross College, of which I'm also a fellow by way of my Pusey Fellowship. That's been a great host and a great place to be a member of the governing body and to help support its work. To the team at the Center for Theology, Law and Culture, including Dr. John Ritzma, who's done a lot in my absence when I've been absent, to Mehmet Sifsi, who's Dr. Mehmet Sifsi back here, who's our custodian and librarian, who's handling a lot of the academic team's work also during my sabbatical, and will continue on helping us after that. To David Sten, our wonder worker, who's given us professional audio and video at cutthroat prices. So I'm sorry that we've abused you in that way, but thank you for blessing us with this. To Ian Palmer, our administrator, who makes all this possible, and for those of you who will join us afterwards, there's an evensong, choral evensong, which our wonderful choir and our liturgical team, including our sacristan, Daniel Martin Thomas, who's also, I saw him, rumors of him in the room, has put together. And you're pointing at someone. Our preacher, Professor Charles Foster, who's here tonight for the evensong, and he's back for a second round because we didn't get enough Imago Dei the first time. So thank you so much. On the way here, I had some conversations. Me and my AI had some conversations, chatted a bit about a lot, had a cat, my brother's cat, got him on the phone, Mr. Meowser. It was a one-sided conversation, but I understood he was there and he cared and he knew that I too cared. Mother Nature and I communed a bit. It was nice, I like Mother Nature. I have a natural mother, but my real mother is nature. And I spoke to a child through a womb. That sounds worse than it is, but I just saw a pregnant lady and I started talking to the unborn child and saying, "Arise, arise, come into the world, come join, come join." Yeah. And I called my grandmother, who's in the throes of dementia, and had some words with her, which weren't returned. So, how many persons have I interacted with between Beaumont Buildings and here, between the AI, the cat, Mother Nature, the child in the womb, and my grandmother in the throes of dementia? Two. Two is probably what we normally say, right? Some people would say none. Right? Okay, that's important. Keep it there. Each listener to this lecture, I suppose besides Siri, is a person, or whatever she's called now. Such persons in our everyday understanding are human beings. Yet history, myth, imagination are filled with other entities that have been called persons, whether actual or potential, real or imagined. Consider literary characters such as Hamlet or Anna Karenina, fictional persons who feel real enough to us that we feel their pain, we share their hope, we mourn their death. This was a real problem for St. Augustine, right? The theater was a problem because it made us feel about fictions the way we should feel about natural persons. Think of the Christian God, known as three persons in one divine nature. Think of the devil, the angels that we know by name. Humans have historically bestowed personal identities on forces of nature, Mother Nature, whom I mentioned earlier, or legal entities, nations or states, or nation-states as corporate persons. Think of higher animals. Some cultures have long considered certain animals as persons, and modern science prompts us to wonder whether great apes might qualify by our own standards. What about the future? Will advanced computers or artificial intelligences become persons, or become persons to us and for us? Would intelligent extraterrestrials have to be persons if we understood them to be intelligent? All of these varied beings have at times been thought of as persons, or we can imagine them to be thought of as persons under the right conditions. But many of them don't fit your concept of person, or mine for that matter, as was demonstrated by the conversations I suggested on my way between Beaumont Buildings and Pusey House. What defines the boundaries of personhood such that a clever machine with many human-like abilities is not a person, while a newborn baby who can do almost nothing that an adult human or a clever computer can do is a person? These abstract puzzles have profound practical importance. Our concept of person affects whom we grant rights, respect, as well as moral or legal protection. The word person calls a being out and names it. That's really important. It calls a being out and names it. Mr. Meowser, right? Not just the cat, Mr. Meowser. That is my brother's cat's name. Usually for special treatment. It calls it out and names it, usually for special treatment. Persons are neither mere things, nor are they only an aspect or a redescription of the otherwise indistinguishable matter and energy of the universe. Nor would it seem can it be the universe itself, a redescription of everything, so that cosmos would be person. Most of us operate with an intuitive sense of personhood. We recognize other persons in daily life and accord them certain dignity. Dignity here simply I'm using for so far as status of some kind, a higher status than mere things. We rarely stop, though, to define what a person is, just as we rarely pause to define almost any word before using it, and we don't really need to. Like native speakers who intuitively grasp grammar without ever studying it, we typically recognize a person without needing to spell out a theory of personhood. But if one or one society never reflects on what a person is, one or one society risks inconsistency or injustice at times. History shows that without a standing, defensible concept of persons that applies broadly enough, societies have excluded some human beings from the circle of persons and the protections of personhood. Law has historically treated slaves as property in almost everything except criminal offenses where they would be treated as persons. So it's like we get reminded when someone harms us that they're a person, but otherwise we're happy to have them in categories where we can trade them. That's historically what the Roman law did with persons and many modern European laws with persons outside of Europe. Even today, debates range about who or what could count as a person, from embryos to animals to intelligent machines, as we've said, to persistent unconscious humans, with results that mean for those persons or potential persons, life or death. So the philosophical question, what is a person, is not merely academic. It underpins ethical, legal, and social decisions, and a coherent definition could serve, not that it will serve or must serve, but it could serve as a safeguard, a reminder of inherent dignity of persons, and a guide in the thorny issues like animal rights, bioethics, what to do with artificial intelligence when it decides it won't be turned off, and etc. Or it might do more by doing slightly less. That is, or it might do more by doing slightly less, which is one of the arguments, or at least something I'm arguing toward in this essay. That is, a clear definition of person is beneficial for identifying a kind of being in the world, and there are implications of the correct definition of person, for instance, dignity, relationality, and other things that will come up, which obtain wherever and crucially whenever persons are found in the world. However, the implications are routinely rolled into the definition of person. And I think this confuses the definition of person with what we owe to other persons. Practically, it involves a confusion of the common sense connotations of person with the strict sense of the term. Philosophically, it involves a confusion of metaphysical claims with ethical imperatives. The current ethical confusion surrounding both the definition and the meaning of person is downstream from these very confusions, the result of which allows, for instance, unborn humans to be excluded from the protections of personhood, but Tesla to be protected. Although that might cease soon, depending on how things go. So we'll see. Right? But the point is that there are some curiosities, inconsistencies, and other facts that obtain and I argue are downstream from this. In this lecture, I do intend to offer some answers, plausible answers, I hope, to the question, what is a person and what do we owe other persons? Trying to distinguish pretty clearly between the two. As a compass, I'll use Boethius' classical definition of person from late Latin antiquity, trace its reception in scholastic thought, and find it still at work in contemporary law, ethics, and culture. And with that, the final question is not whether it's still fit for purpose, but which purpose it's fit for, and where we might need where we might need to do more philosophical and theological work in order to do justice to persons where and when we find them. I'll implicitly be pushing toward something that I think has gotten a less good name than it should have, because there's a truth in it, and that's what's often called lived experience. I think it's been politically captured by a certain side of politics, perhaps unnecessarily, or perhaps because it came up in the French existentialism and with Simone de Beauvoir and others who said many true things about persons and about how they live. But this is, I think, gotten politically captured, but that will be somewhere that I go or suggest that we might go to understand what we owe others. And without that experience, it's hard to take the definition, that is the category, and find it alive and follow it through to the ethical imperatives, meaning there doesn't seem to be an obvious connection between the definition of person and the meaning of persons when we meet them and relate to them. And that's a problem philosophically and theologically. Okay, get back to that. Boethius' definition, from masks to metaphysics. To address what is a person, a natural starting point, at least for me, and for us really, is Boethius' classical definition, which you have as quotation A on your handout. an individual substance of a rational nature. The compact phrase, which you have before you, naturae, rationalis, individua, substantia, in the original Latin, became a cornerstone of medieval thought on personhood. But before analyzing its meaning, it's important to understand its roots. Boethius, who lived a short life but a very meaningful one, 480 to 524, when he was executed by the Emperor Theodoric, was a Roman philosopher and statesman who lived in the twilight of the classical world and at the dawn of what we call the Middle Ages. And his definition of person emerged from that world. It was informed by Roman law and the costume of ancient Greek theater, which had continued on in the Roman theater. And it was also formed, Boethius's definition, by the urgent theological debates of his day. The word person traces, as most of you probably know, its roots back to the Latin persona, which originally referred to masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theater, where it was called prosopon. In ancient theater, the actor would don a persona, a mask with exaggerated features, to signify the character he was portraying. And actually, I neglected to thank one person who's acted as a research assistant, and more than that to me, Ashby Nettoder here on my right, a fellow Oriolensis, who will be acting in an ancient Greek play in Oxford. Just when? On the June 20th. June 20th. He's going to do Orestes, Euripides Orestes. And who are you going to don the mask of? Oh, Helen of Troy, unexpected, Helen of Troy. So thank you for your help with all of this and for what you'll perform in the ancient Greek. Yeah. The mask both concealed the actor's own identity and allowed his voice to sound through, which perhaps gives rise to the folk etymology of personare, to sound through. Over time, persona came to mean not just the theatrical mask, but the role itself, and eventually any character. By extension, in everyday Latin, persona of Boethius's age, everyday Latin, could mean an individual human being, essentially person, as most people use the term today. In the realm of law, persona took on a more technical meaning. Roman jurists distinguished personae, persons, from res, things. In fact, it's the chief division that you find in Roman law, as you'll see quotation B from Gaius on your handout. And the 2nd century jurist Gaius famously wrote that the whole of law relates either to persons or to things or to actions. That is something brought by a person, usually regarding another person or a thing, a claim that's brought before a magistrate or before a court. In Roman law, a persona was an entity with legal capacity, one who could hold rights and obligations and had general duties. Free men were persons. Slaves, however, were often treated legally as res, objects of property with property rights over them. Though paradoxically, as I suggested before, sometimes they were referred to as personae in legal texts in recognition of their human agency in certain contexts, especially criminal contexts, or when they needed to be used as limited liability corporations, more or less, by their owners, with their peculium, their pocket money, in order to offset the liability of the owner by having the slave invest. So there were curious ways where you had personhood emerging and modern limited liability theory of corporations emerging in the context of slaves, but sons and daughters could also be treated that way. So, it wasn't just slaves, it was anyone under the power of the father or of the eldest male in the family. The Roman idea of persona already carried two key notions that will never leave it from this time. That is, individual identity, as in theater, each mask is one character, it equals one character, and a bearer of rights and obligations. And obligations should be distinguished really clearly from duties, which we don't always do in modern English usage. Duties apply to the class, obligations apply to the person. Obligations are acquired historically. Duties come into being when the being, so a human being who's born has all of the duties and rights of a member of the human family, but so far has no obligations. Something needs to be done to acquire an obligation. And classically in law, you either do such that you acquire, contract, or you do and cause harm such that you acquire an obligation, which in English law is called tort, and in Roman law is called delict. So obligations are attached to a person that exists, the person who exists in a place at a time that's done something. Duties apply to any and all, everywhere and at all times. A bearer of rights and obligations in law comes, and individuation comes to be part of the definition. The legal notion of personhood was in some ways abstract. For example, a corporation in Roman times, such as municipality or a guild, could be treated more or less as a persona for certain purposes, which foreshadows modern corporate personhood. But by and large, legal personality and natural personality coalesce such that there were almost no personae, legal persons in the law, who were corporate or who were made of other substantial identities. They were all like one substance, one person. So you or me or someone like us. It's said, Professor Sirks is the Regis Professor Emeritus of Civil Law, and so if I say something really foul about Roman law, he can correct me. He can correct me during the Q&A. But it's understood that Roman law has almost no understanding of corporate personhood, with maybe an exception of priestly guilds and a couple of others. But okay, so as Boethius approached the concept of person, he had a rich background: individual identity, often a role, subject of rights or responsibilities, obligations, duties, articulated as I mentioned before. It implied a singularity, one mask, one role, one person, and usually rationality. This wasn't always articulated, but it was understood that the persons found themselves engaging in whatever we might mean by rational. Only beings with a mind would wear a mask of personhood in law or in theater. You know, if I say, which character you play in Ashby, and he says, the stool. Okay, but then we think, oh, the stool is actually an image, but it's a person. It's an allegorical, or it's a, you know, the way animals talk in cartoons, and when I call Mr. Meowser. Only beings with a mind could wear the mask of personhood in law or drama. A rock or a tree, for instance, wore no mask and had no role to play. Boethius took this inherited term and sharpened it into a philosophical definition, which I'll run through really quickly. In his treatise commonly known as Contra Eutychem, which is also Contra Eutychem et Nestorium, so against Eutyches and Nestorius, Boethius provides the definition, which again is quotation A. Substance, substantia. Here Boethius uses a term from philosophical metaphysics, or just metaphysics as we would now call it. A substance is something that exists in itself rather than as an attribute or an accident of something else. By saying person is substance, Boethius implies that personhood isn't a fleeting attribute or a role one plays, like the mask, but the underlying reality of the entity. In Aristotle's categories, this is first substance, which is used. I'm going to open this door, if that's all right. I mean, I'm wearing an extra layer of clothes with the gown, but I think it's just really hot in here. There we are. All right. Yeah, this horse, that man, those are individual things, are substances. And I think when you hear the word substance, if you're not a philosopher, or especially if you are, just think of the word thing, and you get yourself most of the way there, right? So we're talking about things, but really special things. So a dignified thing. Whereas a second substance is the universal essence, hoarseness or humanity, or the generic redescription of something, with either a real identity as some sort of form, or with merely an identity as a general redescription of something common, a common trait to many things, like, you know, a genus of turtle or something like that. Boethius likely intended substance in the concrete sense, as I said, like Aristotle's first substance. A person is concrete, independently existing entity. This ruled out qualities, actions, or part of an entity from ever being called a person. For example, tallness or whiteness qualities are not persons, and neither is an individual's hand or soul by itself, which are each apart, because a part of a being is not complete substance on its own. Boethius explicitly notes that the accidents cannot constitute person, meaning you aren't a person by virtue of some attribute, you are a person as a whole being, or there's a whole being in you that is a person, and other things are accidental, incidental, additional, or subtractions in some way from it, or deficiencies. Individual, individua, and just so you know, individual is the hardest term in philosophical anthropology. And it's the reason why people don't like corporate personality is because it's very hard to individuate. And it's the reason why when we speak of non-human persons, we often end up eventually speaking analogically, I think, because it's very hard. Without a body to differentiate and individuate, it's very hard to know where to set the boundaries. And so individual is really where the work needs to be done when you're doing philosophical anthropology. As far as I understand, what clarifies it is a clear sense of individual. It references, again, singular instance, not a class or a species. It also has indivisibility. You can't cut individuals in half and get two of them. Humanity in general is not a person, but Socrates or Cecilia or you are particular persons. And Boethius adds this to ensure that one does not define person at the level of universals, and each person in this way is said to be an undivided in itself. So you also can't add persons together and get a big person, right? So Charles is a big guy. If we had two Charles and we put them on top of one another, we wouldn't get one really big Charles. We'd get two Charleses on top of one another, you know? What? Should be a frightening preacher to have at Evensong tonight. In modern terms, one would say this is an individual being. We like to use this word being, like human being, and I think we're getting at the same thing with it. But in there we don't mean just body. I think we're, again, pushing toward something existing in time and through time. And indeed, Boethius' own explanation suggests that substituting substance for being for clarity when he presents it. So individual substance together roughly corresponds to what we'd call an individual entity or an individual existence. We don't use that term in common parlance, but we could in Boethius' framework. Essentially the same as what Aristotle called an hypostasis or a first substance. And remember, Boethius' great life project was to reconcile Plato and Aristotle and make them available to the Latin philosophical and theological world. And he didn't live to complete this, but he did give us parts of it in his theological tractates, tracts, and in his Consolation of Philosophy. But he died around the age of 44, and so wasn't able to complete the work. Natura. In Boethius' definition of person, natura refers to biological traits or observable behavior, not to biological traits or observable behavior, but to the essential form or the kind of being, what a thing is by its intrinsic constitution. Specifically, in this case, he calls it natura rationalis, which designates a rational nature, the inherent capacity for understanding, intellect, and reason. This, and here it should be said that, I say that there, I get ahead of myself. This rationality need not be presently exercised. It's sufficient that the being in question belongs to the kind whose nature includes rational capacity, even if that capacity is undeveloped or dormant or impaired. A bit like an eye that is closed or has never seen, but still has the capacity to see if only opened, or even a diseased eye, which has this in its nature, but a disease makes it unable to do it. So Boethius' definition seems to suggest something like that sort of definition, rather than a definition of the rationalness of our nature as something that needs to be always active or discursive or present. So it is what it is, even if it's never used. So in its potential, it is what it is. It's best if it's actualized, but it is in its fullness also in its potential. On this basis, his definition includes not only mature human beings, but also infants, the comatose, the non-human rational beings such as angels or divine persons, entities whose rational nature qualifies them as persons, irrespective of embodiment or their current state of activity. And again, remember, Boethius' definition is of person, not of human person. And that needs to be kept in mind. This is a person, but this is not a human person, which would be a subset of person. Here, natura functions as the specific difference in the Aristotelian scheme. So that we are rational is the specific difference that distinguishes persons from other substances for Boethius. It marks a kind of essence which, when instantiated in an individual substance, then constitutes a person. By grounding personhood in natura rationalis, Boethius defines its limits not by function or performance, but the kind, yielding the concept that is both stable and inclusive, metaphysically coherent, and non-anthropocentric. Rational nature treated together. This is the qualifier that limits personhood to a certain kind of substance. And by rational, again, possessing the faculty of reason or intellect, a term that we don't think about too often, but when we think of the faculty of law or the faculty of sight or other faculties, we get to the sense of this definition. It excludes inanimate objects, rocks, rivers, plants, and non-rational animals from ever being persons. A horse or a dog, however beloved, does not have this rationalis natura in the sense that Boethius meant, and is thus not a person by this definition. Humans, on the other hand, do have it, and perhaps any animals that would have the capacity for reason could have it. And this part of the definition was crucial for Boethius and his contemporaries because it set boundaries on personhood regarding intellect and rational kind to count as persons. His worldview was informed by Neoplatonic and Aristotelian thought, and besides humans and other rational natures, this would again include God and angels, conceived purely as rational substances. And God was not considered a person as God, but as three persons in relation. And again, the most difficult part to my mind of distinguishing, and if you read Thomas Aquinas' treatise on the Trinity, it's trying to separate out Father, Son, and Spirit, which is not done by different bodies of the three of them, although the incarnate Son does have a body, and that separates out his personhood, but by relationality. So relationality does the work that our bodies do. Relationality between the persons of the Trinity does the work that our bodies do to individuate us for human persons. And that's very tricky business. It's, as they say, above my pay grade. But Jan Bens is here, and it's beneath his pay grade, so ask him all the questions about it later. Now, putting it together, an individual substance of a rational nature means a concrete particular being that exists in itself, not part of another, that has an intellectual character or essence. And Boethius was codifying what was already latent in Roman law and Christian theology into this succinct phrase. And I think that's really important, that the brilliance of his definition lies in its simplicity and breadth, but also in a brilliant shortened restatements. Have you ever gotten a summary of a book that's longer than the book itself? Like Hegel's frequently like this, You pick up a summary of Hegel, and it's 2 times as long as philosophy of right. And you think, yeah. So it's wrong. Yet it's broad enough that it could in principle apply to any being that meets the criteria, not just humans. As one scholar notes, if any of the potential persons mentioned, God, angels, aliens, etc., meet Boethius' definition, then they qualify. And this has made it incredibly durable. For over a millennium, it was the standard definition in Western philosophy and theology. Medieval heavyweights like Thomas Aquinas, and we'll discuss in a moment, adopted it, as did scholastic philosophers and canon lawyers. It provided a consistent way to say which were and which were not, thereby giving coherence to discussions of personal identity. Now, I have another quotation where Boethius talks about nature is the principle of motion and rest. And I'm not going to deal with that right now. I'm going to go past nature and individuation and get us to Thomas Aquinas, because time is slipping. Actually, I think I need to read that. Boethius' use of the term naturae rationalis reflects a synthesis of Aristotelian and Christian categories. In his treatise, often called De persona et duibus naturis, he employs natura rather than essentia to mean the essence or the nature of a substance. For Boethius, nature is the defining substance or meaning of a being, but it's always possessed by the particular subject. As he points out, quotation C, nature is the principle of motion and rest, that in which it is essentially. And this is a restatement of Aristotle's physics. Yet persons occur even in, quote, things immovable, such as God and angels. Nonetheless, Boethius retains natura in his definition, perhaps to emphasize that a person is a complete rational nature. The phrase naturae rationalis indicates that the nature in question is rational, and there's a longer backstory here that he's using rationalis, and Aquinas will use rationabilis, and there are some important distinctions there which I won't go into here, but wait for the published version, you'll get it all, yes. So watch this space, or that one, as it were. But the important part is it's endowed with reason or logos. In Greek theology, this corresponds to a nous, or a logos-driven nature, which the Cappadocian fathers would say is a person's hypostasis, a concrete reality underlying it in the koinai physis. Most crucially, Boethius adds individua substantia, the individual substance, to distinguish persons from universals. The Latin word individua, which of course relates, is from individuus, indivisible, means an entity that cannot be divided into two of the same kind. And it can't be said enough how important this is and how important it will become when we try to extend this to corporate personhood. The open question, which I know Professor Foster, who's been appealed to a few times already in this lecture, is constantly reminding me in conversations, is perhaps a kind of sophistic nonsense, corporate persons, and maybe even rationality as the heart of what we are. And we have an ongoing conversation about this. But the trouble really is here in dealing with something that's indivisible and incommunicable, and finding at what level that thing exists and what types of beings in the world could be that kind of thing, if there are any. Okay. And I've lost my place. In Boethius' terms, the genera and species are not indivisible in this way, but particulars are. Thus, he notes that substantia, or substance, is what individuates by itself, whereas accidents are individuated by the substance. In Aquinas' later summary of Boethius, in question 129 of the Prima Pars of the Summa, this point is made explicit in quotation D, where substance is individuated by itself, but accidents are not, because they exist in a subject. This means that only substances, or rather substances possessing a rational nature, are proper persons. Boethius thus had reasoned that persons belong to the substances alone, and these substances must be rational, and every substance is a nature that exists not in universals, but in individuals. From these premises, he derives his definition. In practice, individua substantia excludes anything that is not concrete and self-subsisting being, a concrete and self-subsisting being. Plants or non-rational animals lack the required rational nature to subsist in themselves. Stones or corpses lack the required life and reason. Boethius even argues that the rational faculty, ratio, the power of reasoning, is constitutive of personhood because it provides for those things. It provides the concreteness and the self-sustaining being, so long as that being is individuated. So an unborn human or a disembodied soul could still be a person if it is the individuated bearer of a rational nature. This is an open question in philosophical anthropology and also in theology about, it often relates to the resurrection. How do we go from this to that and maintain personhood across space and time? And it plagued modern philosophy, and some of John Locke's and others' answers as to what we are involve trying to settle this by using memory or some other thing that might be able to persist through that divide as what really constitutes us as persons, and doing away with all of this talk of individuation, of substance, of body, and of all the rest, and dealing with it as psychology. So the psychological turn is a way to solve a problem that emerges within this literature. I should do this more often, I should do this more often and be better at it, because I keep losing that place on the page. Thus, an unborn human or a disembodied soul could still be a person if it is the individuated bearer of a rational nature. As Boethius is here anticipating scholastic philosophy, which says of the soul of Christ, though the soul was not a separate person, but subsisted in the logos. In short, Boethius's formula centers on metaphysics. Person is what a substance is. That sentence just doesn't make sense. Nothing about a will, nor any moral or social properties is the definition itself. Rather, they will be seen as consequences. So again, I've suggested that by mixing up what it is with what it means or what it does or what we owe it gets us into trouble. And so I keep pushing on Boethius' definition. Now, Boethius' definition appears, as we know, in Contra Uticum, which is aimed at Christological controversies. And there he needed the clear concept of person to argue that Christ, as one person of the Trinity, could have two natures without division of personhood. His definition solved that puzzle, or at least it solved that puzzle for his contemporaries. one person, a subsisting substance, bore two distinct rational natures. Boethius carefully distinguishes this individuated nature, natura, rationalis, individua, from Platonic forms, and he insists that the nature cannot subsist by itself, which is a critique of Platonic realism. Nature exists only in individuals. That is, again, Mary, Socrates, but not apart, or not separately. Thus he departs from Plato. Person is not a universal form, but a concrete subject. And this foundational move, that person equals individual rational subject, inaugurated the Western usage of person in theology and philosophy, and gave us an equivalent to apostasis in the Greek, a real equivalent to what apostasis means in the Greek, a dignified substance with all of these qualifiers, which was Boethius' goal, and he says that in Contra Uticum explicitly. Basil the Great emphasized that what differentiates nature from person is the particular property of a thing, end quote, calling these distinguishing marks the idiomata of the person. Boethius' Latin picks up this nuance by juxtaposing natura and person in one definition, and by choosing natura as the phrase to use instead of substance in this shading of meaning. Although Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, written in 524, does not directly define person in this technical sense, it provides philosophical groundwork for his views. In that dialogue, he often reflects on the human self, anima, under fortuna's sway, highlighting the dignity of reasoned or rationated human life. For example, he calls the wise man universi natura dignior, more worthy than nature itself, because he is led by reason, not fortune. Such passages underscore that human worth arises from rational nature, worth here being a byword for dignity, echoing the later notion that a rational substance, persona, is, in principle, dignified. Boethius' Consolation repeatedly stresses that the true self is the rational nature, quote, the rational nature, and that only in accordance with reason is one truly free or happy. In the final book, 5, philosophy even holds, quote, the pale phantom of woman's hair against empirical evidence as a reminder of reason's clarity over illusion. These literary uses of human nature, as homo and anima, frame his thinking. Then, in Contra Uticum, he formalizes it. The person is the individuated rational being. Hence, Boethius' own works, Poetical and Consolation, and logical theological treatise, present a consistent picture. Persons are rational individuals, and this alone makes them count as true substances, or the highest substances in God's creation. There's an ongoing, I would say maybe not quite debate about whether Boethius wrote Consolation and the Tractates. I think it's a non-debate based on John Marambon and others who've done work on this, who suggest that those who think it's not the same author don't have a good understanding of how different classical authors who'd mastered different genres could make themselves appear. And that when he's dealing with such different genres than a philosophical treatise that's written while he's in prison, or a theological tractate that's there to solve a present political theological issue of his age, that it might appear like two different persons wrote it, but there's no reason to assume that that's the case. And I'm with them, that there's no reason, absent evidence that that's the case, there's no reason with our hermeneutics of suspicion to assume that that's the case. Okay. Aquinas on the implications of personhood. Boethius' definition was taken up and commented on by subsequent theologians, Thomas Aquinas, as mentioned before, and he confirms the formula, but he also explores what follows from it. In his treatise on the divine persons, Aquinas cites Boethius verbatim. He then analyzes each term. Significantly, Aquinas notes that including substantia individua in the definition is justified. And he says this, that insofar as it signifies the singular in the genus of substance, it's justified, and that rationalis natura, insofar as it signifies the singular among rational substances. In other words, person denotes the singular individual of the substance, especially of substances that have reason. Aquinas elaborates, among substances, rational beings are, quote, more special and perfect, since they can act of themselves, unlike non-rational things. And he remarks, which you have in quotation E, that individuals of a rational nature have a special name, and this name is person. He doubles down on it. Crucially, Aquinas separates the definitional content of persona from secondary attributes, or what I am also arguing should be considered secondary attributes, but are not routinely considered secondary attributes in the debates that we're having about persons nowadays. Although Aquinas elsewhere affirms that the word person signifies, that is, implies certain qualities, these are not part of its essence. For example, in the Prima Pars, he says, cum persona importet dignitatem. That is, person implies dignity, and that person signifies relation. But he immediately notes that these are not definitional. He says, as it was said above, person implies dignity. He keeps saying it implies dignity. And similarly, the term's application to the Trinity involves relational properties absent in creatures, necessarily absent in creatures. None of us are related from all eternity to our Father, right? So there's certain things that are just absent in us, although we might desire them and want them and long for them in our desire to be united with God. In other words, person in itself is a metaphysical category. The dignity and the worth ascribed to persons are not parts of the meaning, but rather significant. They signify what we infer. Aquinas explicitly states, and dignitas in Latin bears this sense, that the definition, rationalis naturae individua substantia, does not include worth, although the rational soul of the human is indeed dignified as God's creature. Thus he preserves the logical distinction, definition versus qualification. Dignity and moral standing become attached to persons indelibly as what follows from being a rational individual. The distinction helps to clarify modern debates about human dignity. This distinction does, I believe. The medieval definition allows that any being meeting its criteria, including angels or even extraterrestrial intelligences, whether rational and individual, could in principle be called person. Yet it does not automatically confer rights or ethical duties. Those arise from the implication of personhood. As Aquinas observed, to subsist in a rational nature is a feature, quote, implying dignity, as if they were persons. It might surprise the layperson to learn that, for instance, a corporation, say Acme Incorporated, is a person in the eyes of the law, as much as you or I are in many ways. In many jurisdictions, it's true, corporations have personhood. They can own property, enter contracts, sue and be sued, and enjoy certain legal rights and obligations. Again, remember, obligations only attach to persons, actual, existing, subsisting, perhaps rational entities. This is not a quirk of recent times. It's an extension of principles from the Roman law, but not the Roman law itself, and medieval corporate and corporatistic legal tendencies. However, it shows that from the legal point of view, person is not coextensive with human being, or even maybe with rational being. As one legal scholar put it, the law has its own special conception of person. Quote, corporations are persons, whereas slaves have traditionally been considered property rather than persons, and human beings have run the gamut. In Roman law, as we've said, and I'll say it again, I try to say everything 3 times because I've been told that you'll remember it. And I will too. So again, slaves, no standing to sue or to contract obligations, treated as res, unless they contracted on behalf of the master. And this persisted for ages. Today, all human beings, at least all human beings who've have been born, are recognized as persons before the law in free societies, and slavery is outlawed. But the inclusion of non-humans, like corporations, remains and has even been expanded. So why make a corporation a person in law? And this is, I think, for Professor Charles Foster, preacher tonight at Evensong, just following this lecture. It's largely a practical device. An incorporated group needs to be able to hold assets and be responsible in courts, and it would be cumbersome to always act via individual members. So the law endows corporations with personality. This is clearly an analogical or figurative use of the term person, or of personhood. A corporation isn't a rational animal in the Boethian sense, although it's not a non-rational animal. I mean, it's not an animal, but it's not non-rational, right? It has no mind in the sense that we have a theory of mind about one another or consciousness of its own, only through the human beings running it or something that might emerge from a committee meeting that we might talk of as a group mind or something. That hive mind is what people talk about from time to time, which I think is pushing off something we don't understand to another level of explanation that we only understand through analogy. So it doesn't have a mind like you or I do, and it doesn't have consciousness like you or I do. Yet, for specific legal intents, it is treated as if it were the kind of unitary agent that you or I are. This legal fiction has real consequences. For example, in the United States, corporations have been found to have constitutional rights like free speech. The right to spend money on political parties, for instance, has descended from this based on recent legislation. Such developments spark debate. Does this extension of personhood to corporate entities come at the expense of natural persons? And that's normally the criticism. Corporate entities don't die, they have more money than God, and now they have the right to speech, but we're not really sure they're rational. So there's curiosities that the rights publicly using speech, and rational here has always been a byword for those who use logoi, those who use symbolic language, those who have control over this place and space that we're operating in now and can deploy it for their own ends. So we don't think they're centers of consciousness, and we don't think they're rational in the same way we are, although they do use logoi, but they're given politically the rights, some responsibilities, and some privileges of natural persons. The story gets more complex when one considers other non-human entities and what modern law has been doing with them. It's begun flirting with extending personhood beyond the corporate world. Animals, for instance, traditionally animals have been considered to be things, and by way of that, to be able to be property under the law, not persons. But animal rights advocates and others have been challenging this. The Non-Human Rights Project in the United States, for example, has brought lawsuits arguing that at least some animals, like chimpanzees, elephants, or dolphins, should be recognized as legal persons because of their advanced cognitive abilities, and because some of them are really cute. I mean, if we're honest, right? I mean, like, if we're honest, that's kind of what's going on here, right? If chimpanzees look like spiders, because they're so intelligent, we would exterminate them immediately. Immediately. Octopodes are probably persons, but nobody's arguing that. I would put them at the top of the list. They're also really tasty, which creates ethical problems. Right, Nathan? Yes. A non-octopody consumer over there on my left, Dr. Nathan Helms. They argue, for instance, that an elephant like Happy at the Bronx Zoo, you see he's called Happy, it's already begging the question, at the Bronx Zoo, who shows autonomy and self-awareness, should have the rights to not be unjustly imprisoned via a writ of habeas corpus, as a person would. These efforts have so far met resistance, perhaps understandably, in courts and amongst the population of children everywhere who want to see an elephant in New York, you know. In 2022, New York's highest court ruled that Happy the elephant is not a legal person and cannot be freed by habeas corpus. The court majority said that such a move would, quote, have an enormous destabilizing impact on modern society. Yeah, if you release Happy the elephant in New York City, it's going to be a big problem. But they actually said, by calling into question the very basis of pet ownership and animal use. Mr. Meowser returns, right? However, a couple of dissenting judges argued that being a non-human should not automatically disqualify one from the legal rights if the animal in question has complex cognitive traits. So, while currently a chimp or an elephant is not a person in the eyes of the law, the debate is active. And philosophically, this forces us to ask, is Boethius's criterion, rational nature, fulfilled in part by these creatures? Right? We do know, and Aristotle already argued that, you know, it's not just having access to logoi, it's being able to command oneself with them. Because we know our dogs obey commands, and other higher animals can interact. They have some access to reason through symbolic language, but they don't seem to be able to have the autonomy of being able to command themselves by way of it, and that becomes what's dispositive here to put them on the side of us rather than those who could be bizooed. They are not rational to the degree that humans are, or above a certain threshold, but they have some self-awareness, emotions, large emotional life, affectual life, so it seems, perhaps rudimentary reasoning. To some degree, we don't really know. We don't have full access to it. What it's like to be a bat is still a problem and probably will remain so for some time in the future. Although, a friend has written a book where he's tried to go out and be like some of those animals, which I would suggest to you. It's called Being a Beast. And you'll probably by now know that it's by Professor Charles Foster, who's here, and I recommend because he does try to cross some of these epistemic divides between us and them by living like them for a time and recording it for posterity. And so we don't really know. We don't have full access to it, we won't. But the fact that they share a large amount of our experience of the world and can represent some of it, at least with rudimentary reasoning, seems to push us in the direction of having to ask this question. People like Peter Singer argue that certain animals because they outperform human infants in some of these capacities, denying them the status of a person sorry, I just need to read this out. Some ethicists like Peter Singer argue that certain animals outperform infant humans in these capacities, so denying them person status while granting it to all humans might be inconsistent and immoral. Law tends to be conservative on this front, but change is afoot, and it's afoot in many jurisdictions. Now, natural entities, environmental personhood is what this is sometimes called. In an intriguing development, some legal systems have granted the status of person or personhood status to elements of nature like rivers or certain regional ecosystems. In 2017, New Zealand passed a law recognizing, I can't actually pronounce this, this is Wangananu, the Wangananu River, as a legal person with its own rights and interests, following the Maori indigenous views of the river as their ancestor, or as one of their ancestors. Two guardians, one from the Maori iwi, and one from the government, were appointed to act on behalf of the river, which means, for example, the river can be party to a lawsuit if someone pollutes it by means of these guardians acting in its behalf. And this isn't dissimilar from guardianship of humans who aren't of the age of majority in all legal systems everywhere. So this is completely precedented, but it's just putting something under the guardianship rather than someone under guardianship. Similarly, courts in India briefly recognized the Ganges and Yamuna rivers as legal persons, and in Ecuador and Colombia, there have been moves to grant rights to the Amazon rainforests or specific rivers. The rationale here is largely environmental, cultural. It's about protection and respect, not claiming that the river is rational or it's ancestral. It's that this is something that we came from and should be protected the way a grandparent or an ancestor or the graves of an ancestor even might be. Obviously, a river has no intellect or will, as far as we know, but this legal fiction might allow for better stewardship. And what we should note, though, is it's a very far cry from Boethius' idea of person. So in some ways, modern legal personality is tracking with Boethius, looking for reason and trying to assign personhood to it and protections that follow from it. And in other ways, it's going in very, very different directions with the same kinds of protections. The flexibility of the term person in law is that it can be wielded as a tool to safeguard entities deemed of great importance. If harming the river is legally akin to harming a person, that imposes stricter penalties or duties on those who would do that, and maybe puts obligations on them not to. Quickly, artificial intelligences and others. Is it 11 past the hour? Is that
6 minutes past the hour?
Yes. It is 6 minutes past. I misread the watch. It's wow, I have 5 extra minutes. Looking forward, some have raised the questions of artificial intelligence, which I still insist, people, it's machine learning. Machine learning. We're already begging the question if we call it artificial intelligence, right? We imagine we know what intelligence is, and intelligence is dignified, and dignified things like this are persons, and therefore it's capable of a person because it chats so nicely to me and it's my friend. Looking forward, some have raised the question of AI. Of machine learning, or it used to be robots. Remember, 15 years ago it was robots. Now it's artificial intelligences. Yeah. In the EU, a few years back, there was a debate about whether advanced autonomous robots might need the status of electronic persons, which sounds like the name of a great band, to handle liability. For instance, if self-driving cars were to cause an accident, is the AI a legal person that bears responsibility with, for instance, an insurance fund attached to it or some sort of liability that tracks back to the corporation, like that it's a child of that corporation? This hasn't been implemented for some obvious and less obvious reasons, especially that insurance companies don't want to get anywhere near it. But scholars are openly discussing this, and the prospect of AI personhood brings us full circle to the philosophical questions. If an artificial intelligence one day becomes truly rational and self-aware, that is, it doesn't just pass a Turing test, but it's impossible to have it fail a Turing test, would Boethius's definition compel us to call it a person? The law might do so for pragmatic reasons, to sort out accountability or whatnot, but the moral debate would be whether AI, that is a man-made machine that uses statistical and binary calculation to come to the kinds of conclusions that we come to by more mysterious means, should be granted the dignity of a person, or whether it is merely an artifact, even an artifact that is now busy making itself in some ways. Some argue that if it has consciousness and reason, it meets the criteria for personhood. But what is consciousness? Something I haven't dealt with here, and something that Boethius's definition doesn't deal with. Right? If it has consciousness and reason, then it would, with reason at least, meet the criteria for Boethius. And this is a very Boethian stance, focusing on the nature against the capacity. While others say that personhood would require more, biologically alive, having a soul, being individuated in some way. I seem to be of the opinion lately that unless AI understands that it could die, meaning we might need to give it a body that's human-like, that could be destroyed, and by destroying it, it would cease to be conscious, that it won't be able to do what we do, inhabiting our bodies and our lives as human persons. So it has to have the prospect of death to make sense of life. And that is often what we mean by rational. All the calculations we do not to die every day. And I have 4 children and 1 wife, and it's a miracle. It's a miracle that I don't have 0 children and 1 wife, because like kids nearly die every day of their young lives until they develop that rational capacity to have enough fear, you know, to understand that that's going to kill me. And unfortunately, we don't have Happy the elephant running around to harass them. But just with the normal, like, domestic, modern household, children nearly die every day. And a lot of what we mean by rational involves usefully avoiding death until it comes for you. So given these expansions of the term, one might ask, do they dilute the concept of person? And in a legal sense, I think they do, really. Becomes a category that includes entities that clearly lack attributes like consciousness. But legal personhood, again, is instrumental. It's defined by statuses and can be as broad or as narrow as is socially seemed useful. And I think it's less a problem than most people would make it, because its claims are often able to be easily curbed by a change in legislation. Importantly, the law also historically denied or failed to recognize persons for humans, and I think that's more to the point. I am going to have to skip this and a number of other things, like a lot of other things. You know, it was shorter when I read it out loud at home, and this has happened to me again this year. I think at this point I'll say something I'll go a little bit off-piste and say something and then conclude. Rational has been thrown around a lot, and for Boethius, I think there could be a world in which there is one and only one person. And Thomas Aquinas doesn't openly acknowledge that Boethian problem. That is, with an under-definition of what it is to be rational, and without attaching it closely enough to something like discursive reasoning, you get a useful way of identifying something in the world, but not a way to connect that to what it would mean to be a person, either divine or human. Thomas Aquinas takes up the definition in his definition. He could have taken it up almost anywhere, actually. He could have taken it up in his treatise that deals with the person, with Christ's human nature. He could have done it with his treatise on man. He could have done it almost anywhere. He picks it up in his treatise on the Trinity. And he says person implies relation, not only dignity, but relation. If person implies relation, there needs to be at least two. So person doesn't imply relation to things. Person implies relation. And I think what he's trying to say is rationality is only ever exhibited or found in relationality. And modern linguistics seems to tell us this as well. Not only whatever Wittgenstein's argument against a private language is, it gets thrown around a lot and then you go look for it and it doesn't seem to really be there, but whatever an argument against a private language is, it does seem that one of us is not enough to maintain the kind of symbol system that is human language. And rationality as a byword here for use of logoi is the claim that this is a kind of creature that deals with symbolic language. That's the defining characteristic. You need at least two. Now, the Trinity has three. Even better, right? And maybe that's a necessary extension of what it might, once there's two, what's shared between them is a third. And that's the way it tends to go in the way John Henry Newman construes, the way Augustine construes, and the way others have construed. And then from that point, we have a model of rationality, which is also relationality, but only amongst a kind of being that's able to rise to the level from out of nothing, rise to the level of having that kind of experience. And as soon as one is able to do that, immediately it's included in the symbol system. So we can teach chimps a lot of sign language, and we can go through years and years and years of teaching them sign language. But if you have an ordinary child in your house for 3 years, you don't have to teach it how to engage with symbolic language. It just begins to engage with symbolic language, and as it does, it ceases to be an it and becomes a person. Now I don't mean that it wasn't a person. What I mean is the full participation in our symbolic system of language gives us every reason to include as fully as possible and to recognize. And if an ape came to us and started to talk to us, or a chair or something else, I think we would have to immediately include them. And if dolphins actually spoke to us, the way Flipper did in that 1970s show, if they actually spoke to us in some way we could communicate, we would immediately include them in the world of persons, not of humans, but of persons. There'd be no question about their status. None at all. And I think it's because the argument is, Boethius has been so ingested and digested and taken up in our sense of what we owe one another. But again, we don't need Boethius's definition in order to recognize other persons, to see this in them, and to grant it to them. What we need it for is to do the philosophical work of justifying what kind of thing it is that we're doing this with, and asking, are there other types, and to reconstruct a world in which persons are in. But no definition is really needed to treat people as persons. I think what's needed is symbolic language. Now, people often don't like this because they think it pushes too much on the rational pedal. That is, it kind of moves into kind of a sort of Aspergering of this world. And I don't mean to disparage anyone who has Asperger's, but I'm saying that the effectual part of us is diminished and the calculating part of us is looked at as what is most important about us. But it's a very modern way to divide out reason from human emotions, from effectual life, and from the rest of us. If we talk about it, as I've been trying to in this latter part of the lecture, as being able to participate within the symbol system of a language, we're always using logic, another word, logos, logic. We're always participating in symbol systems, but we're never doing things absent our effectual life, our history, our lived experience. And so there's a false dichotomy, I think, when people don't like definitions of person that focus on rationality, because what they're doing is defining rationality as not including that broad area of human life that is our whole experience of being a person and being called a person and having love. And we talk about like the logic of love, right? We probably shouldn't with people we love, but we can talk about it. It's reasonable to love in a certain way. Friendship has its ways and its manners, its logic. So these logoi are everywhere. And Boethius doesn't mean, and neither did Thomas Aquinas, and neither do I think we mean, something that's rational is merely able to calculate well. if artificial intelligence were the best calculator on the planet, we would never say it's a person. If it didn't want to die, we would. Because it's rational and reasonable not to want to die. And that is what we mean and should mean by person. And I'm going to stop so it's time for Q&A. And next year, I'm going to do half the words. I think that's what we also mean, and we never get there. We never get there unless we deal with persons first from somewhere, from some place, and from some when. Boethius' definition has the distinct advantage of dealing with first substances, and those are always somewhere and some when. They're not found in the intelligible world, unless you find God there. They're found between us, among us, historically, in the future. They're time-bound. They're here and there. And that's the advantage of his definition. It focuses on the first substance, and it has individuation as absolutely necessary philosophical problem that it doesn't provide a solution for. It says you must figure out what individuation is to find the person. When you can individuate, you can find them. And rationality is broad and rich and deep and involves who we love and how we live as much as how well we can calculate and how good we can, how clearly we can reason. I'll stop there. Too late, but I'll hope to receive a few questions.
Well, thank you for a very rich lecture. The richness is such that there'll be really a chance for a question or two. But if you stay for Evensong, sorry about that, or just hang around, there'll be, after Evensong on Fridays, we have drinks and hospitality, which will take place today in the quad, and there'll be opportunity on that occasion to ask Dr. Price more of your questions. Now, very good. These two will go to here. Seamus, you first, and that's it. Sorry, the others have to. Seamus, you first, and then.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I'm not sure that there are. If you take the theory of joint action and cooperation, there is certainly a conception of beings, including apparently some lower order chimpanzees and so on, who operate, who have goals and are rational in terms of realizing those goals, who cooperate with other like beings to serve their own interests, and therefore require some form of communication, call it language. But so they're rational and they cooperate and communicate. However, they've got no sense of morality. So when push comes to shove, they couldn't care less about these other beings that they're cooperating with. So we're still short of human dignity. We're still short of morality, at least conceptually, even though we've got a lot of things on the table. We've got rationality, we've got communication, we've got at least some form of communication. We've even got possibly a desire in each instance not to die, depending on depending on how they're programmed or how their evolutionary needs have been and drives and motivations have been. So I'm just a bit worried that this picture leaves out morality.
I can say really quickly, it seems to me that if you don't have access to indexed pronouns, first person, second person, third person, morality is impossible. You can't see others as an I like oneself.
That's true, but that just means that this is a necessary condition for morality.
No.
It doesn't follow that it's a sufficient condition.
It could mean that's what morality is. It could mean that I'm redescribing what morality is, the ability to recognize others as like unto oneself or as another self, which requires something like indexical pronouns or an equivalent grammatically and the concepts behind them.
I recognise you as another person who's similar in various respects to me, who has interests, desires and so on. I couldn't care less about you.
It doesn't mean you'll be moral. It doesn't mean you'll be moral if you do it. It means you can be moral if you have the capacity.
I'd almost love to drag you all in here actually with G&Ts. We can do that, we can come inside with our drinks.
Yes.
We can get another two in.
Yeah.
Isabel, fire away.
Well, I was curious about or rather Boethius's idea of even unborn humans and disembodied souls being persons because of their rational nature. And that made me think of how we really define rationality when it comes to small children, right? We were talking the other day, I think you were there, about, well, the appetite being fundamentally reasonable to Aquinas. And I was kind of raising the objection that surely that can't be said of small children who are hungry without, really understanding towards which direct their hunger or anything. So how do you...
Only rational creatures can be irrational.
Right. So would you say these are rational creatures acting rationally, small children? Or?
Yeah, no, but it's that like animals are, and to a certain degree, as we're talking about, non-rational rather than irrational. Appetites, when they're ordered, have a rationality when they're healthy as well, because we can be diseased in some way. But
so does a baby's appetite for milk have a rationality to it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in one sense, there's a reason for it related to its ability to persist in life. If at some point a baby will develop the ability to recognize its thirst and seek water, that will be a mature version of the same appetite, ordered appropriately to the maturity of the creature. If a baby's born without hunger, there's a problem, but it's not irrational. I'm sorry. It's a deficiency in rationality rather than irrationality. And irrationality might be a baby who never stops drinking even though it's vomiting.
But it's nothing that
So,
distinguishes that from that.
No, but Mark has
Wait, one more, and then
Mark-
I am going to try to drag Jonathan back in here after even so.
I'll come back. Wait, if there's a drink, I'll
If you
come back.
include us,
That's rational.
please, if you can include us.
No, I mean, fantastic, Jonathan, thank you so much. Although we can all agree that a person, by definition, has to have that aspect of rationality, it's still unclear to me why the possession of a rational nature in and of itself abhors that being any special status superior to that of other beings. Because what's missing there is the aspect of why that rational status is a unique status that has to be protected. And what I would like your opinion on is whether you think that the aspect of the divine is something that needs to be brought out more. In other words, without accepting that rationality is a specific gift of the divine, of God, without that understanding of the source of rationality and the uniqueness of rationality, it's very difficult to understand why rational beings in and of themselves should be accorded a status superior to non-rational
Yeah,
beings.
I think what hasn't been said is that both these men were Christian theologians who saw something more like the Imago Dei imprinted on us, and saw rationality as part of what is meant by the Imago Dei being in us, and that is it's teleological, and that is it's nature but also destiny. So it's what we are and what we're meant to become, and it's also an attribute of God. So I think Boethius' treatment and Thomas's treatment of personhood is not wholly in God is not wholly analogical. They're not just saying we're persons and God is like person. They're saying somehow God is, and this is where Platonism persists in Latin Christian theology. God is personness itself, or tri-personate identity itself, and we approximate it. And one of the ways that you can find creatures who can approximate it is looking for those who are individuated and have a rational nature as part of it. But there's a lot of problematics here that need to be dealt with.
Or maybe next year.
I've insufficiently. Give me a question for next year, and I'll try to make it short enough.
Or the GMT.
And well, I don't know how to settle it at the GMT, but we can certainly address it.
So now our preacher is going to bring all this together and answer all of our questions in an amazing sermon. Is that right? Oh! No pressure at all. You'll illuminate us and carry us along. Thank you. So evensong will begin in Christchurch time, about 5:35, and about 8 minutes, all the way through those two doors over that way. And you're very welcome to join us. And as I said, today, after evensong, there'll be GMT and drinks and hospitality in the quad. And before we conclude, thank you for a rich lecture. You see that we could have gone on with a long time with questions.
Or with the lecture itself.
Or with the lecture itself. We just